Have you ever played a video game and thought to yourself, I wonder what this would look like in Minecraft? I know I certainly have. And that's why I've spent the last year building all of Breath of the Wild in Minecraft. Last time, we completed the bottom right corner of the map, finishing up the Faron region. Today, I turned my eyes westward, aiming to finish the entire bottom side of the map. Yeah, there's a lot to cover in this episode. Moving out from the Great Plateau, we'll follow the path towards Gerudo, finishing up the Colosseum on the way. Heading past the Dig Dog Suspension Bridge, we'll build up the entire Wasteland region, including the first labyrinth we've built so far. After cleaning up the entirety of the desert, we'll finally build the highly requested Gerudo Town. Before we can move on to build Von Naboris, however, we'll have to head north first to build the Yiga clan hideout alongside the rest of the Highlands. Now, I already know what you guys are getting ready to ask in the comments. Grazzy, are you going to build Tears of the Kingdom? It releases in like a few days. Are you going to build Tears of the Kingdom? Yes! I am going to build Tears of the Kingdom, but I have to finish the Breath of the Wild map first. Please be patient with the project. But enough screwing around, let's finally get started on the most requested region. Alongside the road to Gerudo Town, just north of the Great Plateau, is the Colosseum. I figured since it's right at the start of the path we're following this episode, we might as well build this up here. Luckily for us, the world had already generated a gap in the mountain, so we didn't really have to bother much figuring out the scale, since the world just kinda gave it to us. But the Colosseum would still prove to take quite a while. We began by establishing a height for the build and marking out where each floor would be. The block palette was simple enough as well, consisting of some basic stone blocks and some darker deep slate for the floor. After we got much of the basic structure done, Ownbrains and I started on the exterior. We had a lot of trouble spacing out where some of these pillars and windows would go, as the windows and everything had to also line up with the interior, which was a whole other problem. Monoshish had been working on the interior while we were building the outer walls. There were a lot of these archway pillar sort of things in the interior that perfectly lined up with some of the exterior designs, so we had to change quite a bit of the build we had made thus far to ensure that everything lined up correctly. With the basic cylindrical structure done, we were ready to move on to some of the finer details. We punched the gate into the front side on the left, before moving in to finish the interior. I added a lot of the round staircases on each floor while Mono worked on some of these balconies, as well as roughening up the structure a little bit to match the ruined feel of the game. Before long, we were finally ready to move the Colosseum down into its proper location, and finish the rest of the small peninsula it sits on. Goat had worked on a lot of these large malice pools outside, which we already had a block palette for from when we built Varuta. We added some of the dead trees, the small ruins, prettied up the mountain a bit, before adding in the bridge, which is a design that we've already built in episode 2. Across the river was another small peninsula that didn't really have much to it, so I figured I'd quickly finish this area up as well. There was pretty much just a stable, a shrine, some ruins on the mountain, and a few trees scattered about. And of course, we added a bunch of tall grass to the region as well to make it look more complete. Continuing along the path as it proceeds south, we come across the Dig Dog Suspension Bridge, a collection of islands and bridges which is sort of like the entrance into the Gerudo region. After lowering the water to the level it was supposed to be at, I began to shape up some of these islands, the center of which taking up the most time as it was like a giant, I don't know what shape this is, it's like a Beyblade, it's shaped like a Beyblade I guess. I put all the rest of the small islands in place and properly fixed up the stone color, before Ownbrains and I began to design the bridges that go between them. We used primarily dark oak for this, and they were all pretty much the same design, we just had to change the angle and height of them. There was also a Hinox on the main island, which you probably saw we pasted in, as well as a shrine below one of the others. But at this point, I ran into a very big problem. Here's a pop quiz for you guys. What color is this cliff here? It's sort of like a sandy yellowish, and it's the color of every single rock throughout the Gerudo region. But then you look at the cliffs from an angle like this. Suddenly, it looks a bit more red-orange. So what color do I make these cliffs? I was trying all sorts of different blocks, and just nothing was quite matching the color. And on top of that, I'm a bit colorblind as well. So it's like, are any of these colors I'm saying actually what you guys see? I have no clue. Eventually, I settled on this pretty extreme orange-red color using acacia blocks and orange terracotta. Listen, I'm not completely happy with this palette either, and I'm likely going to change it eventually. I had to move forward with the project though, so I just settled on this palette and started painting all of the Gerudo cliffs. Moving into the Gerudo Canyon, I began to place some of the monster camps and shrines in this area. Compared to the rest of the Breath of the Wild map, this area is honestly quite empty, especially because there's no trees or tall grass to put in place. There was still some terraforming to do, however, in the forms of rocky arches over some of the path. But it wasn't long before we got to the scaffolding. The entire Gerudo Canyon is completely covered with scaffolding, spanning up and down the cliffs, going all throughout the valley, which, as silly as it seems to say, this scaffolding was the worst part of this episode. I don't know why, it was just so boring and painful to sit here for hours building this scaffolding, especially because I knew how fun the desert was going to be once we got there. We used jungle wood and mud bricks as the main palette for the scaffolding, with dark oak support beams. And that's pretty much all there is to say about this scaffolding. All of it was pretty much the same. We were able to reuse some of the sections of the scaffolding. For example, there were some platforms and overhanging structures that were copy-pasted all throughout the valley. But overall, we had to build most of these platforms by hand. But I'm skipping through this pretty fast because there's just not much interesting about the scaffolding. Further up the mountain, however, it gets a bit more interesting as the Wasteland Tower looms above. There was a bit more scaffolding and terraforming to do, of course, but most of it was pretty trivial. Spectacle Rock was also missing its bridge between the two large boulders, so we had to spend some time terraforming that. Before moving deeper into the desert, I wanted to complete the mountainous region south of the Wasteland Tower. There isn't too much down here, apart from, of course, the South Lome Labyrinth. I did add a lot of the smaller details before moving on to the labyrinth itself. There was a bit of terraforming and a lot of ruined guardians in this area, oddly enough. And I also added all of the snow on top of the nearby mountain. And also, side note while we're here, just down the cliff nearby is the Teobab grassland, which is home to the Baobab trees, I think that's how you pronounce it. So many of you guys were curious to see these specific trees, so I figured I'd show them real quick. We did complete this whole region of the map as well, but there's not really anything else worth showing here. We made a bunch of variations of these trees, including tall and short ones, before we pasted them all around the valley. But now, with these quick side notes out of the way, we can start on the South Lome Labyrinth. A whole bunch of us builders gathered together to work on this labyrinth, including Goat, Omebrains, Ezio, and Mono. Luckily for us, this is the only labyrinth that is completely symmetrical. The basic structure of all four corners is identical, meaning we only had to build one corner and copy and paste it to the other sides. We quickly finished outlining where all of the walls would go, using deep slate as a temporary block before going back later to add a more intricate design. We started with the innermost pillars and began working our way out from there. As for the block palette, we used a lot of mud, jungle wood, and brown mushroom blocks to give it that sandy brown feel. All of the walls have an identical design except for the outer ones, so we were able to copy paste the same design all around. The others had already begun work on the outer walls, attempting to carve out the dragons that are along the entrance. As they finished up this part, I began work on the design for the outer walls as a whole, using a lot of the same blocks as the inner wall with a bit of mangrove added for a red flare. Once we finished the entire outer wall, it was as simple as copy and pasting this entire corner to the other three, completing the labyrinth. As you can see in this overhead shot, it looks pretty cool. However, although the basic structure is completely symmetrical, the actual maze itself on the inside is not. So, Goat and I spent a couple hours going through the entire maze, carving out a completely accurate path to Breath of the Wild. Eventually, we did complete the interior of the maze though, and it only took like an hour or two. There were still a few things around the area that needed to be done, such as the cabin and the shrine up on the mountain. There were more ruined guardians, a bit of terraforming to do. But that did not really take too long, so this whole labyrinth area was complete. Going back north towards the valley we were working on earlier, we're only a short distance away from the desert. In the valley there were some more overhanging rocks and these strange gateways, but that was pretty much it for this valley, apart from the quarry of course. Down by the stable just outside the desert there is a large sort of quarry area, some sort of mining operation was going on down here, with these large gray square rocks. I thought that the cubic stones would look pretty strange, but they actually look really cool. Like, I'm really happy with how they look in this area, actually. As I was working on the large stones, Mono was building up the large overhanging rock in the middle of the quarry, while Ombrains was adding in some of the finer details around the area. A huge portion of the mountain was also just completely missing, so me and Ghostly had to add that in. And finally, we're moving into the desert. Instead of jumping straight to Gerudo Town, we're going to loop clockwise all the way around it, building up the entire desert first. We started with Kara Kara Bazaar, as it's kind of the first thing on the path to Gerudo Town. I was working on the large rock building in the back, while Ombrains and Goat worked on some of the stalls out front. The shape of the rock was surprisingly tricky to get right, but I got there in the end. Once the building on the bottom was put in place and the structure was done, Toby and I worked on draping some of the cloths over the top and adding the path all the way up and around. There are also a lot of palm trees at the small oasis, which we just reskinned some of the old palm trees from the last episode to fit the desert. As for the interior of the main room, Ombrains and Goat took care of that very nicely. Further south, deeper in the desert, are the 7 Heroines. This location needs no introductions and has been highly requested by you guys. I once again started by just establishing a simple structure for the statue. And once again, I really don't know how I keep doing it. I just kind of nailed it on attempt 1. The structure for the statue itself came very naturally to me, and I didn't really have to go back and change much of it here. The sword was a bit of a different story though. It was a lot more tricky to get the size and the length of the sword down properly. But it didn't take too long, and after that I went back to add a lot more smaller details with red sandstone. Once the first statue was completed, I rotated it on a 45-degree angle and built up the second variation. After both statues were done, I began to put them all in place with the shrine in the center. To finish out the 7 heroines, I built the ruined walls along the outer edge. Not gonna lie, I hardly even noticed that these were here until I was building this location, but yeah, they exist. The walls don't have that complicated of a design though, so I finished them up pretty quickly, and the 7 heroines were complete. As I'm sure most of you guys know, there are a lot of large bone structures sprinkled throughout the desert. I wanted to complete these first so that we'd have a bunch of them to copy and paste around the area. It took Ombrains and I quite a while to figure out how to build the spine, as the vertebrae and the different angles of them all were quite tricky to stitch together. But after a lot of trial and error, we finally got there, and the rest of the rib cages were not that bad since I've already had some experience building those. There were also some large rocks in this area, which were honestly quite a pain to make because I'm just so tired of terraforming at this point. Far to the south in the East Barrens is another patch of ruins. A lot of these ruined structures would also be reused in areas like the Arbiter's grounds, so there wasn't much more ruin building in the desert. I think technically this is where Naboris is when it's trampling around the desert, but later we decided to build it a little bit closer to the town. Speaking of closer to the town, I also built up the outpost at this time, which didn't take too long and went very smoothly. I don't know if it's just because this ended up being super accurate to the game or something, but for some reason, I just really love how this outpost looks. Continuing along the desert was the southern oasis, which again was just more rocks, palm trees, and a Molduga. Way back when Hyrath first built Najdra for episode 3, he actually designed a Molduga as well. I've held onto this piece of footage for like 7 months, and now I finally get to show you guys. His Molduga design turned out really well, I think. It's a shame we only get to use this 4 times in the desert. Just nearby was the Arbiter's grounds, which for the most part was just reused ruins from the East Barrens, but there was another Molduga here. Further along on the northwestern side of the desert, There are more ruins, bone structures, shrines. Again, a lot of it's just copy and pasted. I did design up some of the mini heroine statues, though. They kind of look like Megatron, I'm not gonna lie, but, like, we're gonna ignore that. There were also, of course, giant boulders for me to build, because the game just knows how much I love to build those. There is one last thing we have to build before Gerudo Town, however. The Gerudo Great Skeleton. Unfortunately, I did pause my recording for part of this building session, which is why you suddenly see a bunch of progress in the blink of an eye. But we just reused the spine and the rib cages from the previous bone structures we made, just changing the shape and angle of it a little bit. So you pretty much already saw the building earlier. As for the Great Fairy Fountain beneath, we already built one at Kakariko Village, so we were able to copy and paste it and just recolor it. We added some of the shoulder plates and one of the large fins on the right side, before moving on to the head, which was going to be quite challenging. Goat and I started with a basic sphere for the back of the head, and began to outline the large, sort of pincer jaw things that come out. I don't know what they're called. You guys know what I mean, though. The large spiky things. It wasn't extremely challenging to get the shape of it all right, it just took a lot of trial and error. The lower jaw was honestly quite a breeze, though. Since we had finished the top one, we just had to follow the same angle, and the curvature was natural. With the first of 3 great skeletons done, we can now move on to Gerudo Town. Now, I know what you guys might be thinking. How am I going to get into Gerudo Town? Because I am a Vo. Well, luckily for us, I've got that covered. Because of where Gerudo Town is located on the map, we had to build the entire town at a 45-degree angle, which made everything just a little bit trickier. A whole bunch of us logged on to start on the town, including Sly, Ombrains, Goat, and Ghostly. The plan was to complete all of the outlines for the entire city first, because I didn't want to design half the city only to find out later that the scale we went for was too small or anything. So the logical option was to finish lining everything out first. As the outline was finished up, a bunch of us split off to do our own work. Goat and Ombrains worked on the entrance gate while I was still working on the inside. With most of the buildings outlined, I began to bring the walls up so that I could put in place all of the waterways, which are used to distribute water throughout the entire town. As I was finishing up the waterways, Ombrains was working on the 6 small palm trees in the center plaza. As I moved over to the other side of town to complete more of the waterways, Goat was working off what I had finished to add all of the smaller details, including some interiors and this stone sand seal statue that Sly designed. Once all the waterways were finished and the left side of town was designed, we moved into the center plaza to outline all of the market stalls and add the smaller details. We used a lot of colorful wood blocks like mangrove and warped, as wool is just too strong of a color and it didn't really give us the gentle slopes like stairs and trapdoors do. Moving to the other side of the town, there isn't much over here except for a couple market stalls and the Noble Canteen. I hope I remembered the name correctly. After finishing up this alleyway, I worked on the bar, complete with flower pots and sea pickles to look like cups. As I was working on that, Ombrains was also finishing up another interior nearby. We don't have time to go over all the interiors, especially because, you know, we may have forgotten to record some of them. But rest assured, we did complete every interior in the town. With the bulk of the town complete, we moved on to the palace. I finished outlining where some of the interior walls would go, before Goat and I began to work on the buildings surrounding the palace. On either side, there are these 2 rectangular buildings, the first of which on the right being a sort of military training area. I think. I quickly finished the most of it, including a mini heroine statue in the back. While I was working on that, Goat was also working on the classroom nearby. The one where they teach each other to love? I don't really think there's a better way to word that. Into the other room on the left side of the palace is where the best sand seal, Patricia, lives. Not much to say about this room, it was pretty much just some sand and this random little structure. Moving on to the inside of the palace itself is the throne room. I built up this room on my own, including the little Gerudo warrior statue, but Ombrains later came back to pretty it up even more and add a lot more small details. Up above the palace is Riju's bedroom. Surprisingly, it was a bit tricky to actually figure out where this bedroom was and how big it should be, because the scale for Gerudo Town was... it was a little bit tight, I'm not gonna lie, but I still think our rendition of the town is pretty accurate. Riju's bedroom was also very fun to make, and oddly enough, it has like a lot of gold and just like treasure in the walls. I don't really know what that's about. Above the bedroom, however, is the iconic triple rock structure that just has like an infinite water pool that distributes across the whole town. Like, I know that infinite water sources are possible in Minecraft, but apparently they are in Breath of the Wild as well. I was very concerned about making this rock, and it took a couple of tries to get the size and scale right. However, I think it turned out alright. It's decent. It's passable. Zooming all the way back out, we have completed all of Gerudo Town. All we had to do was build up some of the outer walls a bit more, and of course, figure out a block palette for the main rocks of Gerudo Town, because they're not just gonna stay as lime concrete. It took a little bit, but for the rocks, we eventually settled on a palette of oak and jungle wood. And with that, Gerudo Town is complete. As much as I would love to jump straight on to building Von Naboris, we should probably finish the Highlands first. Moving our way in that direction, Mono had already started on this long strip of ruins. He separated them into 3 parts and tackled them one by one, and he did a really good job on these. I have really bad memories of these ruins though, because of all the times I failed that stupid ice mission. Speaking of the ice mission, he also did build the Icehouse at the end of the ruins, which is a sort of turtle-shaped rock with a little home underneath it. He told me it was pretty tricky to get the shape of the rock right, but I think it turned out alright in the end. There was also this small part of the desert that we had neglected to do earlier, and guess what? It was all rocks! There's just so many rocks to build in this stupid desert. And a lot of these were overhanging rocks, which made them even worse. Ghostly helped me out a lot with these rocks, however, so it wasn't all that bad. I'm gonna be skipping over a lot of this pretty fast because it's just not that interesting, and I'm sure we all want to just get to Naboris. And the Yiga clan hideout, of course. There's also, of course, the Gerudo Tower coming out of a massive chasm in the ground. A lot of you guys asked me how I was gonna do this, and I just decided to use black concrete and black glass to make a bit of a fog effect at the bottom. Well, Sly did. He was the one who actually made the fog at the bottom. There was also some more scaffolding and small enemy encampments around this area as well. As for the actual bulk of the Highlands, there really wasn't anything, honestly. There were some enemy camps, some snow, some rocks, a lot of interesting stuff. I did put in the 8th heroine statue, but it's identical to the ones that we already built earlier. Ombrains also built up that weird electrical shrine on the north side of the mountain. And in these shots of her building this, you may notice that the snow just doesn't look that good with the cliffs. The orange-red just did not mix with the white very well. So I did end up toning the amount of snow down a little bit, changing it so that the snow was only on the top of the cliffs instead of spread all along the side. With the emptiness of the Highlands complete, we moved straight on to the Yiga clan hideout. And guess what was waiting for me as soon as I got here? More giant rocks. There were these massive overhanging cliffs along the valley up to the hideout, and in total they took actual hours to complete. Especially this massive overhanging one with the large cylindrical hole in the middle. The chunk of land that the hideout was supposed to be in was also just missing, so I had to put that in place, which took like another hour because it was just another giant rock. But finally, I was getting to more of the fun stuff. Going back into the valley, I added all of the small frog statues and the hanging strings all across, before heading into the hideout itself. As I'm sure you all know, the first and main room of the hideout is a miniature replica of the 7 heroines. It was a bit odd to make them because of the shape of the room, and it ended up looking more square-like instead of cylindrical, but I think it works. I can get away with it, right? As I was finishing up the statues, Ombrains was working on the pedestal in the middle, while Goat was working on the entrance. Moving along deeper into the hideout, we got to the room where the Gerudo warrior is kept prisoner. I used mostly deep slate for the walls and a lot of the structures in this area to mimic the dark feel of the hideout, but Ombrains had the genius idea to use yellow candles as mighty bananas, so we were even able to add all of the bananas in place. It's a bit hard to show with the replay mod, but as you can see, we finished up the first room of the hideout, which helped establish a block palette and feel for the rest of the build. Moving along into this big main room, it was a little bit of a tight fit. It was hard to squeeze everything in, but I think I got it and that it works. I also got the little balcony at the top, the chests on the top of the pillar, and added in all of the square stones near the bottom. After that, the only room left was the small treasure room, which I breezed through in a few minutes. Moving out into Master Koga's boss arena, I pasted in the structure at the entrance, and began to add a lot of the hanging strings around the area. These hanging strings take longer than you would think they would. While I was finishing up that, Sly and Ombrains were working on the center pit, adding the design on the top, the cloth draping over the edge, just prettying the whole thing up. And I know it was kind of hard to see in the replay files because it's a very tightly enclosed space, so here's some footage of me walking around the interior of the hideout. But with the hideout complete, there's only one thing we have left to build this episode: Divine Beast Va Naboris. Logically, we started with the feet of the Divine Beast and began to work our way up. And by we, I mean a lot of us. Me, Ombrains, Goat, Ezio, and Mono were all here to help on Va Naboris. Working our way up the leg was only a little bit of a challenge, as the leg was actually turning out quite well even with the weird angle of it. The main concern that I had, just like with Varuta, was the scale. If we got the size of the leg wrong, we got the size of the entire Divine Beast wrong. So for most of this early part, it was quite worrisome just committing to any design at all. Luckily, the legs are identical, so we were able to just copy and paste this leg in the front to the back, and work on building up the side in between the legs. Goat and Ombrains started work on the two domes that are on top of the legs, the one closer to the head having a bit more of an open feel to it. This is pretty much the only section of the Divine Beast with any light gray blocks, and because of that, I thought it would look out of place, but I think the andesite they chose actually works quite well. Meanwhile, I was working on the underside of the Divine Beast. The entrance is very, very open. Technically, this was part of the interior and should have waited until after the exterior was done, but I mean, it's all open to air, so it's pretty much exterior. With that finished, Goat and I began working our way up the entire side of the Divine Beast. Luckily, unlike Varuta, Naboris is very, very symmetrical. The front half is almost even to the back, and each side is a duplicate of each other. So once we built half of this side, we were pretty much done with most of the main body. I shaped the humps on the back, while Goat got to work on the second dome on the leg. After that, we worked on the back side of the Divine Beast. Ezio had already made the large tail? Is that what this is? I don't know. The weird platform at the back. He had already made this platform, so we just had to stitch it onto the Divine Beast. Moving along to the front side was the neck and the head, which is where things really started to get difficult. The first thing we had to do was build the little area where the belly meets the head. That wasn't even the annoying part, though. Once that was done, I attempted to build the neck, and this first draft, it doesn't really look that good, but I kept it on for now so that I could try building the head. The head was very interesting because of the odd angle that it's at, somewhere between a 90 and 45 degree angle, but with some world edit rotate commands, it became a lot simpler. The ears on the side, I don't think those are ears, but it's what I'm going to call them, were surprisingly not that tricky to shape at all, so that went by pretty fast. As mentioned though, the first draft of this neck really did not look good at all. So to finish up the exterior of Va Naboris, I redid the neck to make it thicker at the base and slim down the further up it gets. As for the interior, I did forget to record parts of it because I'm a dum-dum. When you build 6 hours a day for an entire month, you're gonna forget to record stuff as well. But also, a lot of the interior of the Divine Beast is actually on the exterior, so it was already built. Ombrains and I did the main center room, while Goat worked on the interiors of the humps and the area right below it. Moving back outside, I made the giant purple electricity ball between the two humps, just like when Va Naboris is attacking you in-game. And with that out of the way, we have finally completed the Gerudo region. Now, I can finally go a week without getting multiple comments asking me to do the Gerudo region. In all seriousness though, I'm pretty pleased with how this region as a whole has turned out, and I hope I did it justice for all of you guys who were desperately awaiting the day I built this. As for what's next, we're going to be heading north to complete Tabantha and Hebra alongside Rito Village. And oh my god, there's going to be so much work to do in the next episode. But that's going to have to wait until after Tears of the Kingdom. Once the Breath of the Wild map is complete, I will add all of the new stuff in Tears of the Kingdom to a second copy of the finished map. That way we get the completed Breath of the Wild map and the completed Tears of the Kingdom map. But if there is a location you see in Tears of the Kingdom that you want me to build early, comment it down below because I might do a little bit of an early Tears of the Kingdom video. Also, I might be streaming the game, maybe, so you should stick around for that. But anyways, I hope you all enjoyed this video, and I'll see you all next time.